Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Often we invite former guests to come back to the program whose stories you've heard before, or if you haven't, you can go online and hear their full stories. But tonight's a very unique program because we have a guest coming back not to tell his story, but to tell the journey of his wife. Dr. Norman McCrummen, former Presbyterian minister, was on with the program before, told his journey, but it's really a privilege to have you back, Norman. Welcome back to The Journey Home.
Thank you.
But to tell the other side of the story of your wife's journey, but there's a reason that you're here to tell it and not her. Yes. And really it's a telling of love, so it's wonderful to have you here. Normally when I have a guest back, I ask, tell us your story all over again so the audience remembers, but I'm just going to let you fit that in with the story of your wife's journey. So once again, welcome back, and let's hear the story.
It's an incredible honor to be back, and especially to have the privilege to talk about Nancy, my wife, and her faith, and how her faith continues to sustain her in her illness. But my own journey into the Catholic Church perhaps would have been unimaginable if it hadn't been for the support of Nancy, even though she did not come into the church at the same time that I did. But she was so very supportive as well as our daughter.
And that's often one of the biggest struggles when a non-Catholic clergyman is drawn to the church. Often it's through his reading and studies, which often the wife who hasn't been to seminary may not be able to keep up with it all. It's not always, often a wife isn't as supportive, it's often because she doesn't understand what the husband's going through. Why would you do this to us? But Nancy was supportive of you.
She was very supportive, and of course she saw me watching EWTN for years, and sometimes she would join me, and then as the years went by, she started watching as well, and she had great interest in Catholicism, but like myself, I mean, it seemed too big of a step for me at a certain point, and it did for her, but that changed, and it was a beautiful thing to witness, to see her slowly but surely embrace the Catholic faith. But her own faith had been deep since childhood. She was reared in a very Christian home in Lynchburg, Virginia, and a Methodist home. Her mother had been reared Presbyterian, but they were all in the Methodist church, and they were very active in their church. Her parents were people of the highest integrity, very lovely and gracious people. And Nancy was very active in the Methodist Church and in youth programs and all. And at some point, and I don't know when this was written, but perhaps when she was a young teenager, I just really don't know, but after her mother died, we found in a little religious pamphlet written in her mother's hand descriptions, very short descriptions of her three children, Nancy being the youngest of the three. Tom, Jim, Nancy. And this is what her mother said about Nancy. She has compassion for others, imagination, perseverance. She's industrious, artistic, creative, and deeply religious. And of course, it's not dated. I wish that it were, but at any point, I've heard people talk about Nancy's faith when she was young, and that faith only deepened with the passing of years. She went to Agnes Scott College, and then after college became a Presbyterian, and later was ordained an elder in the Presbyterian Church. She took that responsibility very, very seriously, and then
maybe for non-Presbyterian viewers, that really within the local Presbyterian church is almost side by side with the pastor.
Yes.
And you and I were both Presbyterian pastors. Right. We were They were ruling elders. We were preaching elders, or I forget what we were called.
Teaching elders.
Teaching elders, right? That's what we were, but we stood side by side with our elders.
Absolutely.
She was taking a very strong leadership role then in the local congregation. She was qualified to go on to Presbytery to take
exactly, and
leadership
she
role.
did.
Yeah.
And she did. And when we married, I was not in the ministry, but after our daughter was born, I felt God's call very strongly. And she was very supportive of my going to seminary. And then in my senior year at Columbia Seminary, she said, I want to leave the bank. She'd been an officer at the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. She was really quite a financial wizard, a great analyst, and even was asked to be one of the senior economists at the Federal Reserve headquarters in Washington, which she declined. But she said, I want to leave the bank, I want to be with our daughter full time, and I want to be engaged in the church. So we left Atlanta and went to Waycross, Georgia, and all of her beautiful attributes came forth so strongly, and first in being a mother. She was such a wonderful mother. And then in her role in the church, which she did with such grace. And I saw her faith deepening, and our little family of three. I mean, it was so precious that we were in a church, which was our life, But I did start watching EWTN in those years. And then when the Journey Home came on and I started watching, I was so intrigued by these Protestants who were making the journey to Rome. And occasionally a minister would be on TV, and I would get so excited about that. I thought, my goodness, what courage. And I was reading the history of the church and studying theology, studying the catechism, and it all made such perfect sense. And, that posed a dilemma, didn't it? I mean, someone engaged in Presbyterian ministry, but in the fullness of time, that the Holy Spirit wooed me in. But Nancy contracted this disease of Alzheimer's probably 10 years ago. She was diagnosed 8 years ago. And she had suspected, and she was reluctant to have the test. I never pushed her. But the day came in which she said she wanted to be tested. Mm-hmm. And so she was, and by a neuropsychologist, and there were many, many tests administered, and they proved that she definitely had, at that point, an early form of this dementia.
Wow. Now, was this, again, connections with this after you had come in?
No, it was not.
So
this
she
was in 2007, and I was received in 2011 into the church.
Okay, so
this was in 2007. As I said, she suspected, but was reluctant to have the test, which is perfectly understandable. But when the neuropsychologist gave us the report, it was very grim, and he did not spare any detail of what the future would hold. And when it was all over, literally, I felt that the earth beneath my feet was splitting. Even though I had suspected, I knew about this disease, when it's your own wife and you hear this, your world shakes. Mm. But her response, in great calmness, was this. She looked at me and she said, "Norman, all we have is today. Let's look for reasons to be grateful and happy." Mm. And from that day to today, that is the way she has lived and is living her life. Mm. Even in this certainly much more advanced stage, she still finds happiness in the moment, and she can still express gratitude. Mm. So it's been a great inspiration to me and to others as well. In all the years since 2007, I've only heard her once refer to her condition, and one time in a voice that had not a trace of self-pity, she said, Norman, it's hard to be me. And that's all she ever said. Mm-hmm. She never again, and has not, truly has not referred to her illness since then. She has just valiantly gone forward, doing the best that she can. But
just to clarify for the audience then, in case you were wondering, we're not talking about a woman who's passed. We're talking a woman who now struggles with this.
Exactly.
And you too, together with this disease. Now, sometimes there are folk that struggle with this but don't know they have it.
That's true.
And it's sometimes hard to communicate to them that this is an issue, that it's a problem to move that way. But to a certain, it seems like there's a bit of a blessing that the Holy Spirit opened her eyes to see it.
Yes.
From the beginning, so she could deal with it. Yeah.
That's true. Her eyes were open to it, and it allowed her to embrace it, and to embrace it with remarkable serenity, and which came, of course, from her faith. Mm-hmm. And to this day, that faith still is demonstrated in small ways, but ways that one cannot help but note. Mm-hmm. And so how grateful I am. And it is true, and I know you know this, and perhaps the viewers strongly suspect it. When a loved one, particularly one's spouse, contracts this disease, it deeply affects the relationship and the family and friends, because there is this change in a person, the inability to communicate. And in Nancy's case, her personality has not radically changed at all. In fact, she's sweeter than ever. But the lack of conversation, which began a number of years back, was such a change. And in the intimate relationship of husband and wife, where communication is so natural and it flows so freely as God intended it to flow, for that to diminish and then to all but disappear is a mammoth adjustment for a spouse. And so it was for me, and I must say that her spiritual journey into this disease became a spiritual journey for myself, which had enormous challenges and still does. It challenged me daily to put my trust in the providence of God and to live in His light, because as many spouses have experienced, I went into great darkness as her disease progressed. And in 2011, after having taken her to a hospital in Birmingham for 2 years in an experimental program, in May 2011, the people at the research clinic said, this is not working. And so I retired from the ministry in May 2011. And I knew that God was calling me into a new vocation of being my wife's caregiver. Well, but the same thing was happening to my mother, but that was because of strokes. And so she was living in Montgomery. We were living in Mobile. So after great persuasion, I moved her to Mobile, where I oversee her care, and she's in a very advanced state of dementia. And my point in bringing that out is that not one of us knows what the future holds. And how can a person go into the future where there is such sadness and such change without faith? I really can't imagine it. But having said that, even with faith, it is a colossal challenge at times, a colossal challenge, and it has been for me. And I was so sad watching her decline, and then 2014 came, and our daughter was engaged and was to be married in June 2014, and of course that's the time in which the mother of the bride would be so happily and fully engaged in planning the wedding, but that just wasn't possible. In fact, 2014 saw a very steady decline. A daughter married in June, and by August, it was as though Nancy had been pushed off of a skyscraper. She fell so rapidly in this disease, and it really put me in a very difficult position, and I did go into darkness. But
because you know what I'm wondering?
yes,
I mean, I was a Presbyterian too, and our theology and trying to understand, Lord, what are you doing? What's going on? And it's sometimes a disconnect between, you know, the Old Testament, you do good, you get blessed. If you do bad, you don't. So Presbyterians, we don't believe that. We believe in some way back when God decided, and all these other issues. But we also didn't have a good trump card for what suffering means in the place of our Presbyterian faith. But it almost seems at about the same time the Lord's opening your heart to the Catholic Church, this is what's happening.
That's right.
How were you dealing with that at the time?
Well, thank you for asking, because that was a big part of my spiritual struggle, was God, why? Why is this happening? And there are theologies out there that say, oh, if you have enough faith, dementia can go away. So, you know, Norman, where's your faith? Yep. Or the other extreme is, you know, this extreme predestination, which she was predestined to have this disease, which of course is absurd. I mean, we're all of us fragile. We all live in a fallen world, and anything can happen to any one of us. But it is so true that in the Catholic faith, suffering is looked upon with reverence. All the great saints suffered. St. Francis of Assisi suffered. St. Teresa, the child Jesus, the little flower, suffered terribly, and in that suffering, they experienced a beautiful redemption and a coming closer and closer to Jesus, until in their pain they became one with Jesus. As St. Francis was even in his lifetime called an alter Christus because of that union with Jesus. Suffering has a profound redemptive quality and aspect to it. But when one is in the grip of suffering, forgetfulness takes over. And that is why one needs so badly Christian friends, why one needs the church, the sacraments, daily Mass, to remind oneself that even Jesus suffered and cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so in my loneliness, as she left me in a sense, in my loneliness, one of the verses that I turned to the most often was what I just said, my God, my God. Yeah. If Jesus can say this to our Father, then I can too. Well, I went away for prayer. I went to St. Joseph's Abbey in Covington, Louisiana, and I got away simply to pray in silence. And I prayed and prayed, went to all the offices of the day. And on the fourth day of my being there, I was in prayer on my knees, not in the chapel, but in the little room where I was staying. And God spoke very clearly to me in my mind, not out here, but in my mind. He said very clearly, you are mine. He didn't say, she's going to get well. He didn't say, Norman, you know, you're going to be just fine, just any minute now. Everything is going to be different. He simply said, you are mine. Well, I knew then that I'm his. So even though I have felt alone, I was not alone, and I am not alone. So you can imagine it. The spiritual aspect to living with this disease has been absolutely profound. But in living with it, again, I saw this dignity and serenity in my wife. Now, no question, she went through times of extreme confusion. Our home became a dangerous place for her because appliances, she became fixated with appliances, and she would play with them. The best way to put it, just And it became dangerous. The kitchen became a dangerous place. I got help at home because one has to have relief, of course. But in her confusion, there was a great challenge for me, for our helper, for our daughter to witness the change in her mother. And things in that regard, living in our home, became increasingly problematic. In the fall of 2014, I started having severe chest pains, really as though just a sword was piercing my chest, and I felt like an elephant was sitting on my chest. So I went into the hospital for 5 days, and a number of blockages were found. Fortunately, none beyond 60%, so I didn't have surgery. But the blockages were there, and the stress was there. So my sister from Birmingham and our daughter started looking for a place for Nancy to go. And then an intervention was held. My friends all came to the hospital with letters and with speeches prepared about, Norman, the time has come. Nancy needs to go into atria, into memory care. And I said, but I'm not ready. I'm not ready. Oh, and they were doing it out of love for me and out of love for Nancy. The time has come. She's got to go. And my sweet daughter was thinking about my health, thinking about her mother's health. But I said, I can't do it. I cannot do it. And they said, well, it's got to come. And I said, well, not until Thanksgiving and Christmas are behind. Well, between that point in October 2014 until the end of the year, Nancy declined very sharply. And so on January the 7th, 2015, she went into this memory care unit. Well, there's nothing more unnatural than for a husband and wife who love each other, who are one, to be separated. It's horrendous. I mean, you feel like you're being separated, you're being torn asunder, because we were meant to live together. But in this awful disease, it was not possible in our home for that to be the case. And
I was thinking also, especially because sometimes husband and wives are apart because of a variety of reasons, but there's always the assumption that we're going to get back together.
Yes, exactly.
We're going to come back together. That's not what you're seeing. This is it.
For the remainder of our lives, we would live apart. And so, again, the darkness came, and the realization that I would not, at the end of the day, see my wife. And again, if it weren't for the prayers of friends and family and going to daily Mass, if it were not for the remembrance of how the great saints all suffered, what would I have done? What would I have done? How could I have gone forward if I didn't have the memory of hearing his voice say, "You are mine"? And yet, the consolations came, and the consolations continue to come, but it is still a struggle to live apart from one's wife. And also to hear things such as, it's sort of amusing, and one has to have a sense of humor in all this, but last spring, Nancy asked who I was going to marry. We were out on a day trip, and she just turned to me in the car and said, "Who are you going to marry?" And I said, "Nancy, I'm going to marry you." And then she replied like that, with a phrase she had never used before, "Oh, that's better than good." So from that point on, when I am conscious of a certain grace, I say, "Oh, that's better than good."
We're talking about conscience of this grace, because that's another significant difference between the way we as Catholics understand marriage from what we did as Presbyterians. It's not merely that two people said something or agreed to something. that was done and blessed. It's that we're changed.
Yes.
The sacramental graces that made you and Nancy one in a very divine way, when the divine graces are shared and change you, that never goes away and makes, you are separated but yet connected in a very spiritual way that's uniquely Catholic.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So Catholic and so true. And our union even deepens in this disease as despite my grief, despite darkness, in a way that is very difficult to explain. My heart increasingly became tender and closer to her heart. And I see that happening, even though she can't always understand that we are married. The affection she shows me upon seeing me is the sweetest thing imaginable. I see her every day, and we color. I'm a big advocate of adult coloring books. They're wonderful. And I never knew at this stage in life that I would love coloring, but I love it. She loves it. She was a wonderful artist. And now she colors and I color with her, and we have a very sweet time every day doing that. And of course we have our trips together to the Bellingrath Gardens or just driving around town. But another way that she has wondered about our marriage has been expressed in this way. She says, Norman, I want to marry you. And I will point to her wedding band and I will say, well, we are married. And on one occasion she said in a very grave voice, well, then we must tell people. So, how very sweet.
Let's take a break because let's delve also deeper. Not deeper, but how was she responding then in the midst of her own growing disease to your conversion? Was she open? And then how about her own?
Her own conversion.
Let's get to that right after
indeed.
the break. All right, we'll see you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and our great privilege is to have Dr. Norman McCrummen back. He appeared on The Journey Home back in 2012, and then in 2014 it was either another show or it was a repeat. I can't remember right now, but we're talking about the journey of your wife Nancy, and we've talked a bit now about the trajectory of where her dementia, is it dementia or Alzheimer's? Alzheimer's has taken her, and it's a little a sad tone in it every time when you kind of talk in past tense. Yes. It's hard not to, because it seems like two people. And I know that many of you out there are encountering this with either spouse or parents or maybe even children. I imagine you could imagine that, how you'd feel when your children are all of a sudden going through it because you're older. But I wanted to also talk then. I know you did too. We've kind of set the stage now where she has gone. Now let's go back with the journey a little bit. So she was already encountering this and aware of it herself.
Very much so.
How was she responding to then? It might have been easier if the faith remained the same in the house, but it was changing because you had become Catholic and she hadn't. How was she responding to that?
She responded with great support. She could not have been more supportive or lovelier. This was in 2011 when I was received into the church, in October 2011. It was a very happy day for her and for our daughter. It was a day of immense grace in our family's life. I must say it would have been extremely hard for me to have made that. step into the church without that support, but it was there. But Nancy had not said that this is what she wanted, that she or that God was calling her. And I was very respectful of that. I did not, particularly with her having this disease, I did not want to nudge or pull. I felt it would just be unfair, that it had to be between her and God. And so I was in the church. We went to Mass on either Saturday afternoon together or Sunday afternoon together. But on Sunday morning, I would take her to a Protestant church. And we did that for quite some time. But we would always go to Mass together, as I said, either on Saturday or Sunday afternoon. We had a wonderful church across Mobile Bay and in Montrose that we went to, an Anglican church, Church of the Apostles, and she loved it. I enjoyed it. But as I said, on Sunday afternoon, well, there came after almost a year of doing that, there came a moment in Mass in which Nancy turned to me and said, "Norman, I am Catholic." And I said, "Oh, it's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful." And she said, "Well, I want you to know that. I'm Catholic." And I said, "Well, that makes me so happy, and I know that you are." I said, "But there is a technicality, and that is being received into the church." And she looked at me with a very puzzled face and said, "Am I not? Have I not been received into the church?" And I said, "No, not really, but we'll talk to Father Shields about this." So he's a very good friend of ours, and so I went to him and I said, "Nancy believes that she's Catholic." And he said, "Wonderful, RCIA is going on, you can take her, and that's just great." So we joined RCIA, and things went fairly well in that, and I saw that it was hard for her to follow, but she was eager to go. But Father Shields also was in the class from time to time, and he saw that it was a struggle for her on occasion. And so one day he said to me, "Norman, let's just receive her on a Sunday evening before evening Mass." And I said, "Well, that would be wonderful. That would be wonderful." Now, this is the amusing part. Of course, she had to make a confession. And so we went to the church the day of the confession. We were sitting together, just us, waiting for another priest to arrive for the confession. And Nancy asked, "Norman, what am I going to confess?" And I said, "Well, Nancy, that's entirely between you and God." "Well, Norman, tell me some sin I have done. I want to confess. I want to." And I said, "Well, let's go over the commandments." So we started with the first commandment. And what other gods what things have you put before God? She said, "Well, I've never done that." We went through every commandment, and she looked at me with astonishment that I would ask. She said, "I've never done that." I said, "Oh, my goodness. I mean, Nancy, this means that you're the only person who's never broken a commandment, either in thought, word, or deed." And she said, "Well, those things, no, I haven't done." And I said, "Well, what are you going to confess?" And she said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Well, what about this, Nancy? Have you ever wanted to do something really good, a good deed, but you never got around to doing it?" And she said, "Oh, I've done that." And I said, "Why don't you confess it?" And she said, "Well, you write it down." So I wrote it down on a visitor's card, and she read, she said, oh, "I'm so glad I have this to confess." Well, she went into the confession. It was a very short confession, and she came out. One reason I'm telling you that story is this. Several months later, I went to confession. And this was not in our parish, but in another one in Mobile, the Church of the Little Flower. And I was telling the priest about my struggles and confessing my frustrations and challenges and all. And I told him a great deal about Nancy. And the priest replied, well, don't you know that she has regained innocence? He said, look upon your wife as a very holy person, for that is what she is, a very holy person. What a grace to be given. What a grace, a very holy person. And so from that point on, it was an enormous change in the way that I looked upon her. I mean, obviously I looked upon her with great love, but I also had been looking upon her with sorrow. And still I do at times, but as a very holy person, that changed the dynamic. A very holy person. And I'm in a men's group called the Men of St. Joseph at St. Ignatius Parish. And I said, let me put a challenge before you. Let's hope that there's a way other than dementia that we can regain innocence and become very holy. So my point is, these challenges bring a spiritual understanding that one could not anticipate. And certainly the theological questions are there, the questions about the nature of man, our humanity and all. But also answers come. And for those who are dealing with this as I am dealing with it, I can say that the way to deal with it is to see that person as very holy, as in a state of innocence, and turn to the church with all the graces that the church offers, and take those graces and be in a community of strong believers. We're so fortunate at St. Ignatius Parish to have the Men of St. Joseph, a very supportive group of men who have been as brothers to me. And I have other friends, of course, very strong friends outside the Catholic Church who have been very supportive and been prayer partners with me. Prayer is essential in this dealing with this disease, going deeper and deeper into this disease. And of course, it's so precious to pray with Nancy and to read the scripture. She's particularly fond of the Psalms. I say that because anyone listening or watching us now, read what is familiar. Go to the scriptures that are dear to that person. Sing hymns to that person, hymns that are dear. Read the Psalms, and everyone has favorite Psalms. Read the Psalms to that person, and it will be a blessing for them beyond what we can even measure.
I know from my own time in ministry, dealing with people that have these struggles or Down syndrome children, that you can feel a sense of inadequacy in how to communicate with them.
Yes.
How do you talk to someone like that? Can they hear me? Can they understand me? And so that in itself can form a barrier to being able to reach out to them because you feel inadequate. Yes. I don't understand. What's your thought about that? And how do you get through that struggle?
Well, I would say talk to them as you ordinarily would. Tell them news. Talk to them about their past. I talk to Nancy a lot about her growing up in Lynchburg. I talk about relatives who are long gone. And I talk about her parents as though they perhaps were still living. And I talk to her about her brothers and nieces, nephews, her sisters-in-law. I talk to her less about my family, other than our daughter, of course, because I believe that the distant past is more likely to come back to her. But we also keep photographs around the person of the family and of friends, and we look at the photographs, and I tell her every day who they are and where they are and what they're doing. And I have in her room 2 very large pictures of her parents. And I talk to her about the things that they always loved to do and the kind of people they were and what wonderful parents. Ruth and Howard Rhodes were. And so my point is to try to keep fresh the past. But also, when conversation is not going well, when you find that that person is really not with you, then do something like coloring. Just sit down.
That is a
color.
very fascinating thing, because there is this sense that there is a bit of return to childhood, isn't there?
Yes,
This innocence.
indeed.
There's a bit of returning to childhood there, and recognizing that, and then running with it.
Absolutely. And given that Nancy always loved to paint, well, at this stage, what could be better than a coloring book? And it also gives her a focus. And it's also something we do together. We sit side by side, and she's working on this page, and I'm working on this page, or sometimes we work on the same page together, but it's a very sweet time together. So if someone has a loved one who is in the stage where conversation is virtually impossible, do some kind of simple craft, something very, very simple that they can focus on. And again, I'm going back, though, also keep the photographs there and tell the stories about the people in the picture. Nancy's coming into the church was for her a profound experience of beauty, of love, of grace. And I say love because the church embraced her so warmly. And I mean, they demonstrated that. And she was already going to a women's group called Daughters of Mary. And she continued. I would take her, and then somebody would bring her back to our house Tuesday mornings. That community of faith continues to mean so much to her. And I would also suggest, write this person cards, short letters, send cards, because when the mail comes and Nancy has a letter or simply a card with a signature, it means the world to her. Yeah. But I also want to show you an example of how, as her disease was progressing, how she was turning more and more to the things of the written word, both Scripture and those of the saints. She put this, Scotch taped it to the mirror just over her lavatory so that she could read it every day. This is St. Francis de Sales. Do not look forward to what might happen tomorrow. The same everlasting Father who cares for you today will take care of you tomorrow and every day. Either He will shield you or He will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put aside all anxious thoughts.
Yeah.
She read it and read it, and I have it now in her room. She also kept on the mirror St. Patrick's breastplate, Christ be with me, Christ within me. Right. The whole, and that was a daily prayer, and still continues to be. And what a privilege to see how the Holy Spirit works with someone whose mind is diminishing, but perhaps whose soul is expanding.
Yeah.
This innocence, this holiness can and will expand for those who are truly in union with Christ.
You shared something with me before that I think is important to talk about, because the uniqueness of talking about a conversion to the Catholic Church from a faith life, a sincere faith life as a Methodist Presbyterian.
Yes.
And this is very common, and in our work with converts, you become a Catholic, as she did. If she had been healthy, it still would have been the struggle with, she's older when she becomes Catholic, that it doesn't mean that you abandon everything from before, because we recognize as a Catholic particularly that God has always been active, has always been speaking with her, has always been leading her. So coming into a new tradition is not easy. I mean, you may see everything on paper, then the catechism, I agree with it all, that's truth, it's of the Lord, I bless that, but there's a lot of her old faith that was still very much a part of it, and that's therapy, isn't it?
Absolutely. The singing of hymns, old hymns from the Protestant tradition, that gives her great joy. And I were talking about when I was in ministry at First Presbyterian, Waycross, Georgia, and Spring Hill Presbyterian in Mobile, and what life was like, and I can see that she can follow me at times. That gives her comfort. It's not the abandoning of one's faith. Right. It's not. It's simply an embracing of the fullness of that church which Jesus Christ founded, and receiving the Blessed Sacrament, which one can, in many circumstances, do daily. And the Blessed Sacrament continues to mean so much to Nancy. There are priests who go to this facility where she is on a regular basis. And again, for the family, the receiving of the sacrament is so important. It's that heavenly spiritual nourishment that we need to carry on in this difficult transition.
Another unique part of the Catholic way of spiritual life, which is different than our Presbyterian past, is the communion of saints.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, for her, has that been a support for her?
It has been, and the Blessed Mother is also a part of her thinking and awareness. And to what degree, it's impossible to say, but it's there. But I've got a wonderful illustration for that. In her room, there's a very large reproduction of the Blessed Mother holding the child Jesus. The original was painted by a friend of ours, Stephanie Morris, who's a fabulous painter. And the original now hangs at St. Ignatius Parish in the Marian Center. But I have a copy, and at the foot of her bed on that wall is the Blessed Mother looking directly at Nancy when she's in bed, holding the child Jesus. Her room is a holy place. It is a place of beauty. Her serenity is still there. Her faith in yes, it is a childlike faith, but then didn't Jesus say we must become like children?
Yeah.
And that innocence of a child, the way a child accepts Jesus in such great devotion, as she did as a child, that I see in her and others see in her today.
All right, let's say we've got some people listening who are starting to see this happen to people in their family. Walk with them a bit.
Oh, my goodness, prepare for it. Prepare for it. And do that by talking to one's priest or pastor, certainly to a neurologist, certainly to the Alzheimer's chapter that may be in there. If they live in a city, there'll definitely be one or more Alzheimer's organizations. Get support. Get support from friends and family. Be very open. Tell friends and family, I'm going to need you. I'm going to need you in this difficult transition. But also find people who are and have been for some time dealing with the disease. They will help a great deal. And see it also as a time of deepening one's own faith. More than ever, turn to God and His graces. Cling to Jesus as never before.
Got an email. Tiffany from the West Coast writes, what would you say to a person who is going through an incredibly painful period in their marriage due to illness, and they feel like they don't have anything left emotionally or spiritually? Suffering, of course, can be a good thing and offered to our Lord Jesus, but how do you do that when you feel completely discouraged and depleted on account of a situation beyond your control with the health of your spouse?
I appreciate that person sending that question. First and foremost, throw yourself at the foot of the cross. Absolutely throw yourself at the feet of Jesus and say, I cannot do this on my own. I cannot. I can't make sense of it. I am fatigued. I'm weary. I'm distraught. I cannot do it without you, Jesus. Plead for Jesus to give what he wants to give, and plead for the grace to accept it. And then don't hesitate to turn to others for help. Talk about it. See a professional Christian counselor. Go to your priest. Go to your pastor and pour out. Hold nothing back. There's nothing to be ashamed of in having strong feelings of depression, of sadness, of grief that is unimaginable, perhaps, for someone who hasn't been through something like this. It's probably unimaginable. Talk about it. Pray about it. Get with a support group. Get with a group of Christians and pray, throwing yourself at the mercy of Jesus.
I can't help but think that there's a lot of things that this particular program is about this time, but one of them is that the Lord gave you a word that you're to share with everybody. You are mine. Yeah, I was even telling that to you, but that's what you're reminding them too, right?
You're right, absolutely. Absolutely.
We're his.
I have never had to depend on the grace of Christ as much as I'm having to depend now. Yeah. I mean, there was enough of the old man in me to cling to my own strengths. But there came a point in this journey with this disease in which I knew I had nothing left on my own. I had to have all that Jesus would give.
Got another email. Gemma from Orlando writes, what encouragement could you give to a couple who loves their Catholic faith but knows that a recent Alzheimer's diagnosis is going to change the way the one spouse is going to be able to comprehend and practice the faith and stretch their marriage in altogether new ways?
Continue to go to Mass with that person. Continue. There will come a time in which one will have to help that person as one would a little child to receive the sacrament. But be prepared for that. But continue to go to Mass. Continue to pray with that person. Continue to talk to that person as though the diminishing is not happening. There will come a time in which conversation on one's own part will change. But again, give the assurances of faith very gently to that person. But go to Mass. If it's possible to go to Mass daily, go to Mass daily with that person. And then seek the counsel of a priest for one's own self. How can I embrace this suffering? How can I do it in a way that will glorify God? And out of which some form of redemption will come, not only for oneself and for one's loved one, but for others.
Yeah. Community, because they're going to see you and her in that. Ted from Omaha writes, what can we do when painful things happen in our lives that we can't see a reason for or even explain? Dr. McCrummen obviously has encountered a life-changing situation with his wife's dementia. How do we make sense out of it and help people not question their belief in God?
Well, I think that one must question one's faith. I think it would be tragic if one didn't go deep into that pool or reservoir, that ocean of faith. One must deal with these questions. To ignore it is not healthy. It's not holy either. Christ would have us to deal with the hard questions, and to do so, begging again for wisdom, reading the lives of the saints. It's been very helpful for me to read the lives of the saints who have suffered a great deal. The little flower, St. Therese, has meant so much to me in reading about her struggles, her physical struggles. But again, see it as an opportunity to understand oneself better, one's faith better, and how God mercifully works during difficulties. Because of course He does. Look what happened on the cross, what the Father did, how He used the cross for the redemption of our sins. Well, He will use suffering, our suffering, for redemptive purposes as well.
Norman, why don't we close the program with you rereading that statement here?
Thank you.
That was on her mirror every morning.
This means so much to Nancy. St. Francis de Sales. Do not look forward to what might happen tomorrow. The same everlasting Father who cares for you today will take care of you tomorrow and every day. Either he will shield you or he will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace then, and put aside all anxious thoughts.
Thank you, Norman.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the journey home and sharing your journey and Nancy's with us.
Thank you. It's
what a joy
privilege.
and a privilege for us. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Journey Home. I hope that what Norman shared is an encouragement to you. And remember what the Lord said to Norman, and he's saying it to you. You are mine. We are his. Surrender to him because of his great love for you in Christ. God bless you. See you next week.